the sterile silence of a Manhattan penthouse 70 floors above the city, a single decision was about to be made. Billionaire tech mogul Alistair Finch, a man who built an empire on cold hard data, held a pen worth more than a family car. It hovered over a contract that would channel $200 million into a revolutionary technology. His lawyers were satisfied, his partners were ecstatic. The deal was perfect. But from the shadows of the room, a voice, quiet and trembling, cut through the air. It wasn't a lawyer or a partner. It was his maid. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Forgive me, sir. Don't sign." Alistair Finch didn't just live in New York. He owned a piece of its sky. His penthouse, a glass and steel marvel atop the Odyssey Tower on Billionaire's Row, offered a panoramic view of a world that bent to his will. From this vantage point, the ceaseless swarm of yellow cabs and the millions of lives scurrying below were mere data points, an abstract confirmation of his own ascent. At 58, he was the architect of Finch Dynamics, a titan in the world of predictive AI and quantum computing. He was a man who trusted algorithms over instinct logic, over emotion, and his own judgment above all else. This fortress of logic, however, had been breached by a force no algorithm could predict: grief. 8 months prior, his wife of 30 years, Eleanor, had lost her battle with a swift and merciless cancer. Eleanor had been his anchor, the one person who saw past the billionaire and still saw the ambitious, slightly awkward boy from Queens who dreamed of changing the world. Her absence had transformed the opulent penthouse from a home into a museum of memories, a gilded cage where every polished surface reflected his solitude. Into this silent, ordered world stepped Clara May Thompson. At 45, Clara carried a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with her uniform. She was a ghost in the machine of Alistair's life, gliding through the cavernous rooms with an efficiency that rendered her almost invisible. She cleaned what was dirty, organized what was out of place, and disappeared before she could be truly noticed. Alistair knew her name, of course, and that her agency, Sterling Home Staffing, had called her their most reliable employee. He knew she was a widow with a son in college. Beyond that, she was a function, a necessary component of his life's operating system. He was unaware that before tragedy had forced her into domestic service, Clara Thompson had been Mrs. Thompson, an English literature teacher at a competitive charter school in Brooklyn. She had spent 2 decades teaching teenagers to see beyond the surface of a text, to find the subtext, the foreshadowing, the subtle tells of a character's true nature. She was a professional observer of the human condition, a skill that was now relegated to polishing silver and dusting bookshelves. The routine of the penthouse was shattered in late August with the arrival of Serafina Vance. She wasn't just a business proposal, she was an event. As the CEO of a Swiss-based startup, Ethelred Innovations, she was pitching the deal of a lifetime, a proprietary method for quantum entangled data storage that promised to make current encryption methods obsolete. It was audacious, revolutionary, and if real worth, trillions. The price for a controlling stake, $200 million. Alistair was captivated. Serafina was everything he admired, brilliant, articulate, and ruthlessly ambitious. She spoke his language of qubits and blockchain, but she did so with a European charm that disarmed his natural cynicism. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a sleek, blonde bob, and a wardrobe of tailored suits that screamed old-world money and new-world power. "The digital world, Alistair, is built on a foundation of sand," she'd said in their first meeting, her voice a low, confident purr. "Ethelred is offering a foundation of diamond." His legal team, led by the ever-cautious Marcus Thorne, had been working around the clock. They'd vetted the patents filed in Geneva, traced the company's registration in Zurich, and confirmed the academic credentials of her lead scientists. On paper, everything was flawless. "The structure is sound. Alistair," Marcus had admitted over the phone, a note of reluctance in his voice. "But it's moving fast. Too fast. 200 million is not pocket change even for you. We haven't had time to physically verify their lab in Switzerland. It's all based on documents, pristine documents, I'll admit. But still." Alistair had waved it off. "Speed is the nature of disruption, Marcus. While you're waiting for a guided tour, Google or Amazon will swoop in. Serafina is giving me an exclusive window. It's a sign of respect. We sign on Friday." From the periphery, Clara watched these meetings unfold. She would enter the vast living area to serve coffee or clear away glasses, her presence so unassuming that the high-stakes conversation would barely pause. She saw the way Alistair, a man who hadn't genuinely smiled in months, seemed to come alive in Serafina's presence. She saw the slick, reassuring smile Serafina would flash at him, and she saw the way Marcus Thorne's jaw would tighten ever so slightly. And from her unique vantage point, the invisible observer in the room, Clara May Thompson began to notice things. Small, insignificant details that pricked at the edges of a story that felt just a little too perfect. Serafina Vance was a masterpiece of curated perfection. Her narrative was as flawless as her appearance. She spoke of her time at MIT, her early work at CERN, and the boutique venture capital firm in Luxembourg that had provided her seed funding. She peppered her conversations with anecdotes about sailing off the coast of Monaco and attending exclusive tech summits in Davos. To Alistair, she was a peer, a formidable intellect, encased in undeniable charisma. To Clara, she was a puzzle. The first dissonant note came during a luncheon meeting at the penthouse. Serafina was telling a story about her alma mater, laughing as she described the bitter Cambridge winters. "I practically lived at the Barker Engineering Library," she said, gesturing with a croissant. "Spent so many nights huddled by those drafty old windows, watching the snow fall on Killian Court." Clara, refilling a water glass, froze for a fraction of a second. Her son Leo, a scholarship student, was currently a sophomore at MIT. In his weekly calls home, he had complained endlessly about his all-night study sessions at the Barker Library. He'd mentioned how grateful he was for the recent renovations, specifically the new state-of-the-art triple-paned windows, that made the library one of the warmest, most modern buildings on campus. The drafty old windows had been replaced 3 years ago. It was a tiny, inconsequential detail, a slip of the tongue, perhaps. But it was wrong. A few days later, another piece felt out of place. Serafina often complimented the art in the penthouse, especially the collection of impressionist paintings that Eleanor had curated. Eleanor had a magnificent eye, Serafina said, standing before a Monet. Her voice was laced with a carefully measured empathy. "This piece is particularly stunning, the way he captures the ephemeral nature of light. It speaks to the impermanence of things, doesn't it?" Alistair nodded, his expression softening at the mention of his wife. "She loved this one. She said it was like holding on to a perfect afternoon forever." As Serafina turned away from the painting, her eyes briefly met Clara's. For a fleeting moment, the mask of compassionate connoisseurship dropped. What Clara saw in its place was a chilling void, a flat analytical glance that wasn't appreciating art, but assessing an asset. It was the look of a predator gauging the weakness of its prey. The moment was so brief that Clara almost convinced herself she had imagined it. But the cold feeling it left in her stomach was real. The most jarring incident, however, involved a photograph. On the polished mahogany desk in Alistair's study sat a silver-framed picture of Alistair and Eleanor taken on an anniversary trip to Italy. They were laughing their heads close together, the picture of uncomplicated joy. It was the only personal item Alistair kept on his otherwise sterile workspace. During a break in a late-night negotiation, Serafina had wandered over to the desk, picking up the frame. Alistair was on the phone across the room, his back turned. She was beautiful, Serafina murmured ostensibly to herself. Clara was in the room to collect a tea service. From her angle, she could see Serafina's reflection in the vast window overlooking the city. She saw Serafina trace the outline of Eleanor's face with her finger, and then she saw her turn the frame over. For a few seconds, she studied the back of it intently. It was a strange, almost forensic action. What could possibly be on the back of a photo frame? Clara knew the answer. Nothing except for the small engraved insignia of the jeweler who had made it Tiffany & Co., a detail only someone looking for it would notice. Serafina then carefully placed the frame back, but not in its original position. She had moved it 1/4 of an inch to the left. It was a meaningless, obsessive little action, but it screamed of something that Clara, the literature teacher, recognized instantly. It was a clumsy bit of stage business. It was an actor unsure of their motivation performing an action to appear thoughtful. It was inauthentic. People grieving or feeling genuine empathy don't forensically examine photo frames. They get lost in the image. These moments individually were nothing. A misremembered detail about a window, a cold glance, a peculiar handling of a photograph. Any sane person would dismiss them. Alistair Finch, a man who dealt in petabytes of data, would have laughed them off as statistical noise. But Clara wasn't a data processor. She was a reader of people, and the story Serafina Vance was telling had plot holes. Clara felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. This was not her world. She was the maid. Her job was to remain invisible, to clean up after the titans who moved millions of dollars as easily as she moved a vacuum cleaner. To speak up was unthinkable. It was professional suicide. She would be fired, blacklisted by the agency. Her son's tuition, the very reason she endured this life of silent service, depended on her continued employment. And what would she even say? Sir, her story about the library windows doesn't add up. Sir, I didn't like the way she looked at your Monet. She would sound insane. And yet the feeling persisted, a cold dread that coiled in her gut. She was watching a masterfully constructed play, and she was the only one who could see the cracks in the scenery. The days leading up to the signing were a blur of activity. Couriers arrived with leather-bound documents. The phone rang with calls from Geneva, London, and Tokyo. Alistair was consumed, energized by a passion he hadn't felt since Eleanor's passing. The deal had become his salvation, a project so vast and complex it could finally fill the void in his life. He was moving forward. For Clara, the penthouse felt like it was shrinking, the air growing heavier with each passing hour. The weight of her observations pressed down on her. She replayed the scenes in her mind, searching for a rational explanation. Perhaps Serafina had attended MIT before the renovations. Perhaps her cold glance was just a trick of the light. Perhaps she was just quirky about photo frames. But she couldn't shake the feeling of a meticulously crafted performance. She started observing Serafina with a new, focused intensity. She noticed the way Serafina's accent, a vaguely pan-European melody, would flatten almost imperceptibly when she was frustrated or thought no one was listening. She noticed that for someone who claimed to sail, her hands were flawlessly manicured, with no trace of the calluses or sunspots that came from a life on the water. One evening, while clearing away dinner plates, Clara overheard a snippet of conversation. Serafina had left her phone on the table, and it buzzed with a call. The caller ID was blocked. She picked it up her back to Alistair. "Niteras," She hissed into the phone, her voice a low, sharp whisper. Zadzwonia później. She immediately hung up and turned back to Alistair, her charming smile perfectly restored. A persistent telemarketer, she said, with a dismissive wave of her hand. Clara, who had grown up in a Polish neighborhood in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, felt a jolt. She recognized the language. Nie teraz. Zadzwonię później. Not now. I'll call later. It wasn't the language of a Swiss-German CEO. It was Polish, a native speaker's Polish, spoken with the clipped urgency of someone giving an order. The lie was so small, so casual, but it was definitive. A Swiss national educated at MIT, living in Geneva, would have no reason to lie about being Polish. It was another crack in the facade, wider and deeper than the others. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She sat in her small apartment in Queens, the glow of the city, a distant smear on her window. She thought of her son, Leo, and the sacrifices she was making for him. Voicing her suspicions would jeopardize everything. She imagined the scene her, the humble maid, trying to warn a master of the universe about a deal vetted by a team of high-powered lawyers. The absurdity of it was overwhelming. He would see her as impertinent, delusional. Serafina would paint her as a disgruntled employee, perhaps trying to extort money. She felt a wave of despair. The power imbalance was too vast. It was a canyon she could never hope to cross. Her word against Serafina Vance's was like a feather against a freight train. But then she thought of Mr. Finch. She saw him not as the cold billionaire, but as the grieving husband who still 8 months later would occasionally pause in the hallway and touch the frame of a painting his wife had loved. He was a man blinded by grief and a desperate need for a new purpose. Serafina hadn't just sold him a business proposition, she had sold him a future, a way out of his sorrow. And she was using Eleanor's memory to do it with her calculated comments on art and her feigned empathy. That to Clara was the greatest sin. It was a desecration. The literature teacher in her surfaced. Every great tragedy had a character who knew the truth but was ignored, a Cassandra, a fool, a servant whose warnings went unheeded until it was too late. She had taught those stories for years, championed the moral courage of those who spoke truth to power, no matter the cost. Could she now in her own life fail such a simple, profound test? Her fear was real, a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But beneath it, something else was taking root, a quiet, stubborn resolve. She may be just a maid. She may have no proof, no data, no evidence that would stand up in a court of law or a board meeting. All she had were the details, the wrong windows, the cold glance, the Polish whisper, the lie. All she had was the truth as she saw it. And she had to try. She made a decision. She didn't know how or when, but before that pen touched that paper, she would find a way to say something. She owed it to the memory of Eleanor Finch. She owed it to the lost man living in the gilded cage. She owed it to herself. Friday arrived with the cold, decisive clarity of a perfect autumn day. The sky over Manhattan was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the storm of anxiety brewing inside Clara Thompson. Today was the day of the signing. The conference room in Alistair's penthouse was prepared with meticulous care. The long obsidian table was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the glittering cityscape outside. Leather-bound folders containing the final contracts were placed at each setting. A bottle of vintage champagne, Dom Perignon 1996, sat chilling in a silver bucket, ready to consecrate the birth of a new empire. Alistair was electric, pacing the room with a restless energy Clara hadn't seen in him before. He wore a custom-tailored suit, his silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his eyes, which had been dulled by grief for so long now, shone with ambition. He looked like the man on the cover of Forbes magazine again. Marcus Thorne, his lawyer, stood by the window, a silent statue of apprehension. He had done his job. The paperwork was ironclad. The international wire transfers were routed through a secure escrow account at Credit Suisse, ready for release upon signing. He had flagged his concerns about the speed of the deal, but Alistair had overruled him at every turn. Now all he could do was watch. Serafina Vance arrived at precisely 10 a.m. She was the picture of victory. She wore a striking crimson dress that stood out against the room's muted tones. Her smile was radiant, her confidence absolute. She was accompanied by her own legal counsel, a stern-faced man from a prestigious Zurich firm. "Alistair, a historic day," she said, her voice smooth as silk as she extended her hand. "For both of us, Serafina," he replied, his grip firm. "To the future." Clara's role today was simple: be invisible. She was to ensure coffee was hot, water was cold, and that she vanished from the room the moment she was no longer needed. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silent tension in the room. Her mind raced, searching for an opening, a moment, a way to deliver her warning without being immediately dismissed and ejected. The lawyers began their final ceremonial review of the documents. They spoke in the dry, precise language of their trade, a litany of clauses, sub-clauses, and indemnifications. Alistair and Serafina engaged in light, triumphant conversation, their talk already leaping ahead to board appointments and press releases. Clara moved through the room like a phantom, refilling coffee cups, her hands trembling so slightly she prayed no one would notice. She watched Serafina, who was now playing the role of the gracious partner to perfection. She laughed at Alistair's jokes, deferred to his opinions on market strategy, and made him feel like the undisputed king of this new venture. It was a masterful performance, and Alistair was her captivated audience. An hour passed. The legal teams gave their final nods. Marcus Thorne, his face grim, slid the signature pages in front of Alistair. "Everything is in order," Marcus said, his voice flat. It was the closest he could come to a protest. Alistair picked up the pen, a magnificent Mont Blanc, custom-made for him, its nib crafted from gold and iridium. He uncapped it with a satisfying click. This was the moment. $200 million, the future of Finch Dynamics, his own legacy, all of it hung on the tip of that pen. Clara stood by the service cart near the door, her palms sweating. Her throat was dry. All her resolve from the night before felt like it was dissolving into sheer, paralyzing terror. "Say something," a voice in her head screamed. "Say anything." But the words wouldn't come. She was frozen, a spectator at a catastrophe she was powerless to prevent. Alistair looked at Serafina, a genuine, hopeful smile on his face. "To Ethelred Innovations," he said, his voice full of conviction. "To Ethelred." She echoed, her eyes glittering with a light that Clara now recognized as pure, predatory hunger. He lowered the pen. The iridium nib was a millimeter from the paper. Clara's mind flashed with an image of her son, Leo, standing on the MIT campus, talking about the new library windows. It was a flash of pure maternal instinct of protection. It broke the spell of her fear. She couldn't deliver a logical argument. She couldn't present evidence. All she could do was create a disruption. A pause. A single moment to break the hypnotic rhythm of the proceedings. Her eyes darted to the service cart. A silver pitcher full of ice water stood next to a stack of porcelain cups. Without a second thought, she acted. She lunged forward, her body clumsy, her movements frantic. "Oh, excuse me, Mr. Thorne, you have a—" Her words tumbled out as she tripped over the leg of the cart. The cart jolted. The silver pitcher tipped. Ice water cascaded across the corner of the obsidian table, a wave of shocking cold that soaked a stack of ancillary documents and splashed perilously close to the signature page. Gasps filled the room. The Zurich lawyer swore under his breath in German. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing?" Alistair roared, his face a mask of fury. He was on his feet, his chair pushed back. Serafina's smile had vanished, replaced by a flash of reptilian rage. For the first time, her composure was utterly shattered. Clara stood amidst the chaos she had created, droplets of water on her uniform, her heart feeling like it was about to burst through her chest. She had everyone's attention. She had her moment. She looked directly at Alistair Finch, her eyes pleading. Her voice, when it came out, was a trembling, desperate whisper that seemed to suck all the air from the room. "Mr. Finch." "Sir." "Forgive me." She took a ragged breath. "Don't sign." Silence. A thick, stunned silence descended upon the room, broken only by the faint drip of water from the table onto the Persian rug. Alistair Finch stared at Clara, his face slowly turning a deep, dangerous red. The shock on his face was curdling into pure, unadulterated rage. "Get out!" He bit out each word a block of ice. "You are fired. Get out of my home, now." "Sir, please, you have to listen." Clara began, her voice cracking. "Now!" he thundered, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. Serafina, recovering her composure, let out a small, condescending laugh. "Alistair, my goodness, the help appears to be having a psychotic break. Perhaps we should call security." She waved a dismissive hand as if shooing away a fly. Her attempt at nonchalance was betrayed by the tightness around her eyes. The interruption had rattled her. Marcus Thorne, however, hadn't moved. He was looking at Clara not with anger, but with a sudden intense curiosity. He had been living with a vague, formless unease about this deal for weeks. He knew something felt off, but he couldn't find a single flaw in the paperwork. Now here was the ultimate anomaly. A quiet, reliable maid risking her entire livelihood to stop the signing. It was illogical. It was insane. And it was the biggest red flag he had seen yet. "Wait, Alistair," Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. Let's hear what she has to say. For 1 minute. "Are you insane, Marcus?" Alistair shot back, turning his fury on his lawyer. "She's the maid. She spilled water all over a $200 million contract. Which is why we should listen," Marcus countered, his gaze unwavering. "What could possibly motivate her to do that? What is it, Clara?" All eyes were on her. Clara felt the immense pressure of their combined disbelief. She had no smoking gun, only a collection of tiny, fragile threads. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to be calm to sound rational. "It's Miss Vance," Clara said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "It's the things she says. The details are wrong." Serafina scoffed. "Details? What is she talking about?" "The library," Clara said, looking at Alistair. She mentioned the drafty old windows at the Barker Library at MIT. "My son is a student there. Those windows were replaced 3 years ago. It's a completely modern building." Alistair stared at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and irritation. "That's it. You're derailing this deal over windows. And her accent." Clara pressed on her words, tumbling out faster. "She said that phone call was a telemarketer, but she spoke Polish, fluent Polish. And the photograph, sir. The one of you and Mrs. Finch." Alistair flinched at the mention of Eleanor. "What about it?" "She wasn't looking at the picture of your wife. She was studying the back of the frame. And then she complimented your wife's taste in art. But when she looked at the Monet, her eyes were cold. There was nothing there. It's all a performance. It's not real." It sounded pathetic, utterly pathetically flimsy, a collection of a servant's paranoid observations. Alistair looked at her with what could only be described as pity. Serafina seized the opportunity. She placed a gentle, reassuring hand on Alistair's arm. "Alistair, darling," she said, her voice dripping with sympathy. "Clearly this poor woman is troubled. She's projecting. It's sad, really. Let's not dignify this outburst. Let's just sign the papers and I'll have my lawyer deal with her claims of I don't even know what." She was so smooth, so convincing. She was turning it back on Clara, painting her as mentally unstable. Clara could see Alistair wavering, his anger softening into a desire to simply end the embarrassing spectacle. She had one last card to play, one tiny thread. "The ring," Clara blurted out, her voice rising with desperation. "Ask her about her ring." Serafina was wearing a simple but elegant gold ring on her right hand, a twisted band that was almost identical in design to Eleanor's wedding ring, which Alistair now wore on a chain beneath his shirt. It was a common enough design, but Serafina had on more than one occasion seemed to notice Alistair looking at it. Alistair looked down at Serafina's hand. He hadn't consciously registered the ring before, but now he saw the resemblance. "My ring?" Serafina asked, a hint of steel in her voice. "What about my ring?" "It's just like my wife's," Alistair said quietly, his anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of something else. Serafina's perfect smile returned, now infused with a touch of melancholy. "Yes, I noticed that. It was a gift from my late husband." She met Alistair's gaze, her eyes brimming with shared sorrow. "He bought it for me in a small artisan's shop in Florence, our last trip together before he passed." It was the perfect answer, plausible, heartfelt, and it created another bond of shared grief between her and Alistair. It should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because Alistair Finch, for all his grief, was a man of precision. And he knew with absolute certainty that Eleanor's ring hadn't come from an artisan's shop in Florence. He had designed it himself with a custom jeweller, Benjamin Drake, whose small exclusive shop was located on a quiet street in London. There was no other ring like it in the world. The blood drained from Alistair's face. He looked from the ring on Serafina's hand to Clara, whose face was pale with fear, but whose eyes held a steady, desperate conviction. Then he looked at Serafina, really looked at her for the first time, not as a business partner or a charming equal, but through the lens of Clara's impossible suspicions. He saw the subtle tension in her jaw. He saw the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. He saw the lie. "That's impossible," Alistair said, his voice barely a whisper. Serafina's mask didn't just crack, it shattered. A flicker of pure, unadulterated panic flashed in her eyes. I beg your pardon." "That ring," Alistair said, his voice growing stronger, colder. "I designed it, with a jeweller in London. Benjamin Drake. There isn't another one." The colour drained from Serafina's face. The room was deathly quiet. She had overplayed her hand, walking straight into a trap she couldn't have possibly foreseen. Her story, meant to be the final, perfect touch on her masterpiece of manipulation, had become the loose thread that would unravel everything. Marcus Thorne, who had been watching this exchange with the intensity of a hawk, finally moved. He pulled out his phone. "Alistair, give me 5 minutes," he said, already dialing. He walked towards the far side of the room, speaking in low, urgent tones to a contact he kept on retainer for exactly these kinds of situations, a private investigator in Geneva named Jean-Luc Dubois, a former Interpol agent with a network that reached into the darkest corners of international finance. The spell was broken. The triumphant atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating dread. Serafina Vance, or whoever she was, stood frozen, cornered. Her lawyer began to bluster, talking about slander and breach of contract, but his words were hollow, a pointless noise in the face of the terrible unfolding truth. Alistair Finch sank into his chair, his eyes fixed on the contract he had been seconds away from signing. The signature line, once a symbol of his triumphant future, now looked like the edge of a precipice. He had been saved from a $200 million fall by the one person in the room he had never truly seen. The 5 minutes that followed were the longest of Alistair Finch's life. The air in the penthouse crackled with a tension so thick it felt physical. Serafina Vance and her lawyer stood in a strained, silent conference near the window, her facade of charm replaced by a brittle, furious glare. She shot daggers at Clara, who remained rooted to the spot near the service cart, a silent, terrified witness to the bomb she had just detonated. Alistair sat at the head of the table, staring at nothing. His mind was reeling, replaying every meeting, every conversation, every charming smile from the past several weeks. He felt a profound, chilling sense of violation. He had been so sure of his judgment, so confident in his ability to read people and situations. He saw now that his grief had been a gaping wound, and Serafina had been a predator who had smelled the blood in the water. She hadn't been selling him technology. She had been selling him a reflection of his own desires, a cure for his loneliness, a ghost of his past. The ring wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated piece of psychological warfare. She must have researched Eleanor, studied her, and had the ring meticulously replicated. The forensic examination of the photo frame suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. She was looking for the jeweller's mark. Marcus Thorne paced on the far side of the room, his phone pressed to his ear, listening intently. "Are you sure, Jean-Luc?" "Yes, the registration is in Zurich, but the physical address, a mailbox rental. Check the patent filings again. Cross-reference the lead scientist, Dr. Albrecht." "No, of course he doesn't exist." Every snippet of conversation that drifted across the room was another nail in the coffin of Ethelred Innovations. Finally, Marcus hung up the phone. He walked back to the table, his face a grim mask of vindication. He looked at Serafina's lawyer. "Your client's company, Ethelred Innovations, is a phantom," he stated, his voice ringing with cold authority. "Its listed headquarters in Geneva is a P.O. box at a UPS store. The patents, while expertly forged, have filing numbers that correspond to a Swiss agricultural company's patents for a new type of milking machine." A muscle in Serafina's jaw twitched. Her lawyer opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus cut him off. "And Dr. Albrecht, your supposed Nobel laureate physicist, he doesn't exist. His entire academic history, his published papers, all of it is a fabrication, hosted on a series of ghost websites set up 6 months ago. The venture capital firm in Luxembourg that provided your seed funding was dissolved in 2018. You've built an entire digital mirage, a $200 million lie." Marcus then turned his attention directly to Serafina, his eyes like chips of granite. "And as for you, Ms. Vance, my contact ran your likeness through Interpol's database of known financial criminals. It took him less than a minute to get a match. Your real name is Elena Petrova. You're a Polish national wanted in connection with a securities fraud case in Hong Kong and a real estate scam in Dubai. You specialize in emotional vector cons, targeting high net worth individuals who have recently undergone significant personal trauma. Elena Petrova." The name hung in the air, stripping away the last vestiges of the sophisticated Swiss CEO, leaving behind a common, brutal criminal. The Polish whisper Clara had overheard wasn't a slip. It was her native tongue. The implosion was total and catastrophic. Elena Petrova's face, once a carefully constructed mask of charisma, was now pale and stripped bare. The predatory gleam in her eyes had been replaced by the cold, hard look of a cornered animal. "This is an outrage," her lawyer stammered, his bravado gone. "We will not stand for these baseless accusations." "Then you can remain seated while I call the authorities," Marcus said, his thumb already hovering over the call button on his phone. That was the breaking point. Elena shot her lawyer a look of pure venom, grabbed her purse from the table, and made a dash for the door. Her lawyer, realizing he had been duped as well, or was perhaps complicit, and now abandoned, simply stood there utterly defeated. "Don't let her leave!" Alistair yelled, snapping out of his stupor. But Eleanor was fast. She wrenched open the door to the conference room and sprinted for the private elevator, its doors just beginning to close. She slipped through the gap an instant before they shut, disappearing from view. Alistair and Marcus rushed out into the main hall, but it was too late. The indicator above the elevator showed it was already in rapid descent. "My security team will have her," Alistair said, grabbing his phone to alert the front desk and the building's security chief. "Lock down the building. No one leaves." He barked orders into the phone, his voice, once again, the commander, the titan of industry. But the swagger was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged edge. While he was on the phone, Marcus walked back into the conference room. The bottle of Dom Perignon sat untouched. The contracts lay scattered and useless. The water from the spilled pitcher was slowly seeping into the priceless rug. The entire scene was a monument to a disaster that had been averted by a hair's breadth. In the middle of it all stood Clara May Thompson, trembling, looking small and overwhelmed. Alistair finished his call and walked slowly back into the room. His eyes met hers. The vast, immeasurable gulf between the billionaire and the maid, the employer and the employee, had vanished. In its place was something new, something raw and profound. He walked over to her, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silent room. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the woman who had saved him, the woman he had been about to fire, to cast out in disgrace. He saw not an employee, but a person of extraordinary perception and breathtaking courage. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. It was a mixture of gratitude, shame, and awe. He trailed off, unable to find the words. So he did the only thing that felt right. In the wreckage of the $200 million scam, Alistair Finch, the man who owned a piece of the sky, looked his housekeeper in the eye and said the two words he hadn't truly meant in a very long time. "Thank you." The echo of the closing elevator doors seemed to hang in the air, a metallic finality to Elena Petrova's spectacular implosion. In the sterile quiet of the conference room, the chaos lingered. Water dripped methodically onto the priceless rug, a maddeningly calm sound in the wake of the storm. Alistair Finch stood paralyzed, his mind a maelstrom of shock, fury, and a terrifying, bottomless humiliation. The $200 million he had almost lost was a staggering sum, but it was nothing compared to the price he would pay in pride. Marcus Thorne was the first to move with purpose. He calmly took out his phone again, not to call the police. Alistair's security was already handling that, but to begin the intricate process of corporate damage control. "I'm calling our crisis management team," he said to Alistair, his voice a steady anchor in the swirling chaos. "We need to get ahead of this. We frame it as a victory for our due diligence process, not a near catastrophic failure." Alistair barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on Clara May Thompson. She stood by the now infamous service cart, looking as though she expected a lightning bolt to strike her down. She was just a woman, in a simple uniform, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Yet in that moment she held more power and possessed more clarity than anyone in the room. He saw the whole sequence again in his mind's eye, the faked stumble, the cascade of water, the sheer unadulterated terror in her eyes as she uttered those 5 fateful words. "Don't sign." "Forgive me, sir." She hadn't just been afraid of being fired. She had been afraid for him, the billionaire and the maid. The chasm between their 2 worlds had always been a given and unspoken law of the universe he inhabited. Now that chasm had been bridged by her incredible act of courage, and he found himself on the wrong side of wisdom. He took a step toward her, but no words came. What could he possibly say? "Thank you for saving me from my own colossal arrogance. I'm sorry I almost had you thrown out like trash for seeing what I was blind to." The inadequacy of language was crushing. "Clara," he finally managed his voice, a hoarse rasp. "Go home. Just for today. Go home. My office will be in touch." It was a clumsy dismissal, but it was all he could muster. It was a retreat, a way to process the magnitude of his failure without her steady, observant gaze upon him. For Clara, the journey home on the F train to Queens was a surreal passage between 2 realities. The familiar rumble of the subway car, the crush of commuters, the flickering fluorescent lights. It was the mundane world she lived in, yet she felt completely detached from it, as if she were watching it all through thick glass. One moment, she was facing down a master con artist in a billionaire's sky palace. The next, she was holding onto a metal pole, trying not to make eye contact with the person next to her. The vertigo was intense. She got to her small, tidy apartment and sat on her well-worn sofa, the silence buzzing in her ears. Had she been fired? The way he said, "Go home," felt ominous, final. Or was it a reprieve? She had no idea. She had acted on pure, unadulterated instinct, a teacher's instinct to point out a flaw in the narrative. She had never considered the consequences beyond the immediate moment. Later that evening, she called her son Leo. Hearing his voice, full of the typical undergraduate complaints about midterms and laundry, was a lifeline to normalcy. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" he asked. "You sound a little tired." "Long day, sweetie," she said, the understatement of a lifetime. "How was your quantum mechanics lecture?" They talked for 20 minutes about his life, his challenges, his small victories. She drank in every word. This was why she did it. This brilliant, wonderful boy was her entire world, the reason she tolerated a life of invisibility. She couldn't tell him that she had just saved his idol, the legendary Alistair Finch, from financial ruin. She couldn't say that she may have also torpedoed the very job that paid for his textbooks. So she just said, "I'm so proud of you, Leo. Work hard," and hung up the weight of her uncertain future settling upon her. Meanwhile, Alistair's penthouse had become a command center. FBI agents in dark suits moved with quiet efficiency, bagging the fraudulent contracts as evidence. The story had already broken, and the headlines were brutal. "Finch Dynamics duped," screamed one. The 200-meter honey trap blared another. His PR team, led by Marcus, was masterfully spinning the narrative, but the stink of gullibility was impossible to completely wash away. After the agents left, Alistair found himself alone in the cavernous silence of his home. He walked into his study and stood before the silver-framed photograph of Eleanor. He looked into her smiling eyes. "I almost lost it, Ellie," he whispered to the image. "Everything we built. I was so lost without you, so eager for a new project, a new purpose. I walked right into a trap." He felt a wave of shame so profound it made him physically ache. He had always been the smart one, the visionary. But Elena Petrova had seen him for what he truly was, a lonely, grieving man. She had sold him a story he desperately wanted to believe, and he had almost paid for it with his empire. The week that followed was a purgatory of silence and uncertainty for Clara. A call came from her staffing agency, Sterling Home Staffing. They were bewildered. Mr. Finch's office had informed them that Clara was on paid administrative leave until further notice, and that her salary would be doubled for the duration. It was a gesture so bizarre it only deepened her anxiety. It wasn't a firing, but it wasn't an affirmation either. It was a holding pattern. She spent the days reading, cleaning her already immaculate apartment, and fighting the urge to look for other jobs. For Alistair, it was a week of painful reckoning. He finally called Marcus. "You were right," Alistair said with no preamble. "You were right, and I was an arrogant arse. I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything, Alistair," Marcus replied, his voice softening. "But you do owe Clara Thompson. Her brand of due diligence isn't something we teach in law school. It's called wisdom." The word struck Alistair. Wisdom. It was what he had lost, or perhaps had never truly possessed. His mind was made up. The call came the following Friday. It wasn't the household manager, it was Alistair's executive assistant. Her tone was formal, respectful. "Ms. Thompson, Mr. Finch would like to see you at your convenience. He has asked if you would be available to meet in his study this afternoon." Clara arrived at the penthouse, feeling as though she were entering a different country. The doorman, who usually gave her a cursory nod, now held the door for her with a look of something akin to awe. The story of the maid who stopped the scam had clearly rippled through the building's staff. She was led not to the service entrance but through the main foyer, directly to the study. Alistair was there not behind his desk, but standing by the window. He was dressed in a simple cashmere sweater, not a suit. He looked older, more tired, but his eyes were clear. "Clara, thank you for coming." "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. As she sat, he spoke. "First, I need to apologize. Not just for my behavior that day, but for the months leading up to it. I saw you, but I never truly saw you. You were a part of the architecture of my life, and I never once considered the person living within it. For that I am profoundly sorry." His sincerity was disarming. "And what you did," he continued, shaking his head in disbelief. "You risked your livelihood, your stability, everything on a feeling, on details that everyone else, including myself, had dismissed as noise. You did it to protect a man who had shown you no particular kindness. That is a level of integrity I have rarely encountered." He finally sat down behind his desk. "I've spent the last week thinking about how to properly thank you. A bonus, a reward. It all feels cheap, transactional. It doesn't honor the substance of what you did." He slid a document across the desk. "This is a charter for an irrevocable educational trust. It has been set up in your son's name. It will cover every expense for his education, tuition, housing, books, travel for as long as he chooses to remain in school. MIT, Harvard, Oxford. It doesn't matter. It's done. He will graduate with any degree he wants with zero debt." Clara stared at the paper, her vision blurring with tears. This gift was beyond comprehension. It was freedom. It was the end of a lifetime of worry. "Sir, she stammered, unable to articulate the immensity of her gratitude. "It's the least I can do, Clara," he said gently. "But it's not all." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Finch Dynamics has a philanthropic arm, the Finch Foundation. Eleanor started it. Her passion was finding and funding educational programs for gifted kids in overlooked communities. She believed potential was everywhere, but opportunity was not. Since she passed, it has drifted. It has money and a mission statement, but it has no soul. He paused, holding her gaze. The Foundation's biggest challenge is sifting through thousands of proposals. They are all stories, Clara. Stories about what a school could be, what a student could achieve. The Foundation needs a director who can read those stories. Someone who can see past the polished words and find the authentic narrative. Someone who can spot the wrong windows and the cold glances in a grant proposal. It needs a truth teller. He pushed a second thicker folder toward her. On the cover it read, Proposal Director, The Finch Foundation, C.M. Thompson. Clara's heart stopped. She opened it. Inside was a job description, an operational budget, and a salary figure that made her feel dizzy. Your background as an educator, your innate perception, your integrity. You're not just qualified for this role, Clara. You are uniquely built for it, Alistair said. I don't want you to be my housekeeper. I want you to be my partner in rebuilding my wife's legacy. Clara looked from the proposal to the face of the man opposite her. She saw the wreckage of his arrogance, but also the green shoots of a newfound humility. This wasn't charity. It was a genuine recognition of her worth. She thought of her years in the classroom, of the joy she took in finding the spark in a young mind. This was that on a scale she had never imagined. A slow smile spread across her face, the first genuine, joyful smile she had felt in years. She closed the folder and pushed it gently back toward the center of the desk, a silent gesture of acceptance. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice clear and steady, no longer the whisper of a maid, but the confident tone of a director. I've always believed that the best stories are the true ones. I would be honored to help you find them. The story of Alistair Finch and Clara Thompson is a powerful reminder that insight and courage are not bound by wealth or status. In a world that constantly tells us to trust the experts and defer to authority, Clara's story champions the power of human observation, of listening to that small, quiet voice inside that tells us when something is wrong. Alistair, blinded by his grief and ambition, was saved by the person he least expected. He learned a lesson worth far more than the $200 million he almost lost, that true strength lies in the humility to listen, and that a person's value is not defined by their job title, but by their character. What do you think of Clara's incredible courage? What would you have done in her position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who appreciates tales of everyday heroism. And for more incredible true-life stories that will inspire and amaze you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you for listening.